Some wounds never truly heal, they just learn to hide. Evelyn Matthews discovered this truth at 72 when her morning tea became impossible to hold. Her right hand had swollen so badly overnight that her wedding ring cut into her finger. Like a cruel reminder of better days, the retired schoolteacher shuffled into the small clinic in Millbrook, embarrassed by her appearance but worried enough to finally seek help. Nurse Patricia Williams had seen plenty of swollen hands in her 20 years at the clinic. She expected arthritis or maybe an infection from Evelyn's beloved rose garden. But when she examined the hand under the bright examination light, it caught her eye. There was something small and sharp glinting beneath the skin, something that had been there for a very long time. What could have been hiding in this gentle woman's hand for decades, and why was her body suddenly rejecting it? Now, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Evelyn Matthews' modest two-bedroom home on Maple Street, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floors that Robert had installed 43 years ago. She sat at the kitchen table, her left hand wrapped around a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, while her right hand throbbed with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The swelling had worsened overnight, transforming her once elegant fingers into something resembling overstuffed sausages, purple and tight with inflammation. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like an apple, hung a faded wedding photograph from 1975. In it, she and Robert stood side by side, young and hopeful, her hand resting gently in his. Now, nearly 5 years after his funeral, that same hand had become a source of constant discomfort, a reminder that her body, like her spirit, was beginning to betray her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The house around her told the story of a life dedicated to others. Every wall displayed certificates, thank you cards from students, and photographs from 4 decades of teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. Hand-drawn pictures covered her refrigerator, stick figures with crooked smiles holding flowers, houses with too many windows, and suns with rays shooting in every direction. Best Teacher Ever was written in crayon across a construction paper card that had yellowed with age, but remained her most treasured possession. Evelyn had always been meticulous about her appearance, a habit formed from years of standing before impressionable young minds. Even in retirement, she maintained her routine, hair brushed into a neat silver bob, a touch of lipstick, and clothing pressed and coordinated. But this morning, she struggled to button her blouse with one hand, and the simple act of brushing, her teeth had brought tears to her eyes. The pain had started 3 weeks ago as a mild ache, easily dismissed as arthritis, or perhaps strain from her gardening. She had always maintained Robert's rose garden with religious devotion, finding solace in the repetitive tasks of pruning, watering, and weeding. The roses had been his passion, but after his death, tending them became her way of maintaining their connection. She refused to let them wither, just as she refused to let his memory fade. But as the days passed, the ache in her hand intensified, spreading from her palm up through her wrist and forearm. Sleep became elusive, as throbbing pain jolted her awake throughout the night. Simple tasks that she had performed without thought for 7 decades suddenly required careful planning and often resulted in frustration. Mrs. Chen, her neighbor of 15 years, had noticed Evelyn's struggles during their weekly chat over the fence. Betty Chen was a practical woman, 10 years younger than Evelyn, and blessed with the kind of directness that came from raising 4 children and managing a household while working full-time as a nurse at the regional hospital. She had moved to Millbrook with her husband when he retired from his engineering job in the city, seeking the peace that small-town life promised. "Evelyn, dear," Betty had said yesterday, watching as Evelyn fumbled with the garden hose using only her left hand, "that swelling doesn't look natural. You need to see someone about it." Evelyn had deflected, as she always did when confronted, with concerns about her health or well-being. "It's just arthritis, Betty. At my age, everything aches." But Betty Chen was not easily dismissed. "I've seen arthritis, and I've seen infections. This is something else. Promise me you'll call Dr. Harrison." The Millbrook Community Clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its wraparound porch and gingerbread trim making it feel more like visiting a friend than seeking medical care. Dr. Marcus Harrison had taken over the practice 12 years ago when old Dr. Pemberton retired, bringing with him a gentle bedside manner and the latest medical knowledge from his residency at a teaching hospital in Chicago. At 45, he had the energy to handle the diverse needs of a small town, while possessing enough experience to know when something required more serious attention. Nurse Patricia Williams had been the backbone of the clinic for 20 years. Having started as a young LPN, fresh out of nursing school, and working her way up to head nurse. At 52, she had seen everything from broken bones to broken hearts, delivering babies and comforting families through final goodbyes. Her warm brown eyes and gentle hands had provided comfort to 3 generations of Millbrook residents, and her intuition about patients had earned Dr. Harrison's complete trust. The clinic's waiting room maintained the home's original charm, with comfortable chairs arranged around a coffee table laden with magazines and a puzzle that patients worked on collectively over the course of weeks. The walls displayed local artwork and photographs of community events, creating an atmosphere that felt welcoming rather than clinical. A fish tank bubbled quietly in one corner, its colorful inhabitants providing a soothing distraction for nervous patients. Evelyn had always avoided medical appointments when possible, a trait that had served her reasonably well throughout her life, but had become more problematic as age brought new challenges. She subscribed to the philosophy of many in her generation. If you ignored a problem long enough, it would either resolve itself or prove to be serious enough to demand attention. Unfortunately, her swollen hand had moved firmly into the latter category. The decision to finally seek help had been made during a particularly difficult night when the pain kept her awake until dawn. She had tried every home remedy she could remember: ice packs, warm compresses, over-the-counter pain relievers, and even an old folk cure involving Epsom salts that her mother had sworn by. Nothing provided more than temporary relief, and the swelling continued to worsen. As she prepared to leave for her appointment, Evelyn caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the confident teacher who had commanded classrooms for 4 decades. Her face showed the fatigue of sleepless nights and constant discomfort, and her usually bright blue eyes seemed dimmed by worry. She had always taken pride in her independence, in her ability to handle whatever life presented without burdening others. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat. The walk to the clinic normally took Evelyn 15 minutes, a pleasant stroll through the tree-lined streets of a town where she had lived her entire life. Today, cradling her injured hand against her chest, the journey felt longer. She passed the elementary school where she had taught, its playground empty during summer vacation, but echoing with memories of countless recesses spent mediating disputes and bandaging scraped knees. Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, usually by choice rather than accident. People genuinely cared about their neighbors, bringing casseroles during illness and organizing benefit dinners for families facing hardship. Evelyn had been both a recipient and contributor to this network of mutual support throughout her life, though she much preferred giving help to receiving it. The morning air carried the scent of blooming honeysuckle and the distant aroma of fresh bread from Patterson's bakery. Under normal circumstances, Evelyn would have stopped to chat with other early risers, perhaps picking up a newspaper or exchanging pleasantries about the weather. Today, she walked with purpose, focused on reaching her destination before losing her nerve. As she approached the clinic's front steps, Evelyn paused to gather herself. The white Victorian house, with its cheerful yellow shutters, had been a constant in her life, a place where she had brought students with suspected broken bones, where she had received the news about Robert's heart condition, and where Dr. Pemberton had delivered the results of every routine checkup for 30 years. Now it represented something different, an acknowledgement that she could no longer handle this problem alone. Patricia Williams looked up from the reception desk as the clinic door chimed, her face immediately showing concern as she noticed Evelyn's careful way of holding her right hand. "Good morning, Evelyn. Dr. Harrison is running a few minutes behind schedule, but we'll get you taken care of." The waiting room held 2 other patients. Elderly Mr. Kowalski, who came in monthly for blood pressure checks and was known for his elaborate stories about his service in Korea, and Sarah Mitchell, a young mother with her toddler son who appeared to have a case of pink eye. The familiar faces provided comfort, reminding Evelyn that she was among friends rather than strangers. As she settled into her usual chair near the window, Evelyn realized that this moment represented more than just a medical appointment. For the first time since Robert's death, she was actively seeking help, acknowledging that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had taken physical pain to force her to confront the emotional isolation she had maintained for 5 long years. 20 minutes later, Patricia called her name, leading her down the familiar hallway to examination. Room 2. The room smelled of antiseptic and lavender, Patricia's touch to make the space more welcoming. Medical equipment lined the walls, but cheerful artwork and a small plant on the windowsill softened the clinical atmosphere. "Let's have a look at that hand," Patricia said, her voice carrying the warmth that had comforted thousands of patients over the years. She helped Evelyn onto the examination table, noting how carefully she protected her injured hand. "When did this start, dear?" "About 3 weeks ago," Evelyn admitted, finally allowing someone else to see the full extent of the swelling. "I thought it would go away on its own." Patricia's practiced hands were gentle as she examined the affected area, but Evelyn couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath as pressure was applied to the most swollen regions. The nurse's expression grew more serious as she continued her assessment, noting the unusual pattern of inflammation and the way the swelling seemed to radiate from a central point on Evelyn's palm. "Have you injured this hand recently? Any cuts, puncture wounds, or trauma?" Evelyn shook her head. "Nothing that I can remember. I work in the garden, but I'm always careful about wearing gloves." Patricia made notes on Evelyn's chart, her brow furrowed in concentration. In her 20 years of nursing, she had seen countless cases of arthritis, gout, infections, and injuries. This presented differently from any of those common conditions. The swelling was too localized, too severe, and too sudden in its progression. "Dr. Harrison will be in shortly," Patricia said, giving Evelyn's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Try not to worry. We'll figure out what's causing this." Alone in the examination room, Evelyn found herself studying her hands, something she hadn't done in years. Her left hand still bore the faint calluses from decades of chalk dust and paper cuts, the wedding ring that had never been removed creating a pale band on her finger. Her right hand, so familiar yet now so foreign, throbbed with each heartbeat. The skin was stretched tight, shiny and discolored, making her fingers appear stubby and unrecognizable. These hands had done so much throughout her 72 years. They had guided countless children through their first attempts at writing, wiped away tears, applauded achievements, and provided comfort during difficult moments. They had kneaded bread every Sunday morning, tended Robert's roses, and held his hand during his final days in the hospital. Now one of them had betrayed her, becoming a source of pain rather than capability. Dr. Harrison's gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. He entered with his characteristic smile, his silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, immediately putting patients at ease. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, his expression was both professional and genuinely caring. "Good morning, Evelyn. Patricia tells me you're having some trouble with your hand. Let's see what we're dealing with." His examination was thorough but gentle, his questions methodical as he tried to understand the timeline and characteristics of her condition. Like Patricia, his expression grew more puzzled as he assessed the unusual presentation of symptoms. "Swelling is quite pronounced," he said, reaching for a magnifying glass from the instrument tray, "and there appears to be something here that's not quite right." As he focused the magnifying glass on a specific spot on her palm, Dr. Harrison's eyebrows raised slightly. He adjusted the light, moving it closer to get a better view of whatever had caught his attention. "Evelyn, I'm seeing something beneath. The skin that shouldn't be there. It appears to be a foreign object, something small and sharp." He looked up at her with concern. "Are you certain you haven't injured this hand recently?" Evelyn's mind raced, trying to recall any incident that could explain this mysterious object. "I honestly can't remember anything, Doctor. My memory isn't what it used to be, but surely I would remember something like that." Dr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes our bodies can encapsulate foreign objects for years before they cause problems. What we're seeing could have been there for quite some time. The body builds scar tissue around it, and then something triggers an inflammatory response. The possibility that something had been hiding in her hand for years without her knowledge was both fascinating and disturbing. How could she have lived with a foreign object and never known it? What could it be, and how had it gotten there? "What do we do now?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We need to remove it," Dr. Harrison explained. "It's a minor surgical procedure that we can do right here in the clinic. I'll use a local anesthetic so you won't feel any pain during the removal. The object appears to be close to the surface, which should make the procedure straightforward." The thought of surgery, even minor surgery, filled Evelyn with apprehension. She had always been someone who preferred to endure discomfort rather than risk the unknown complications that medical intervention might bring. But the pain in her hand had become unbearable, and the mystery of what lay beneath her skin had awakened a curiosity that surprised her. "When would we do this?" she asked. "We could schedule it for next week, which would give you time to prepare and arrange for someone to drive you home afterward. Patricia will give you detailed instructions about what to expect." As Dr. Harrison left to check his schedule, Patricia returned with post-care instructions and a prescription for stronger pain medication. "Is there someone who can stay with you after the procedure?" she asked. "It's nothing serious, but it's always good to have someone nearby just in case." Evelyn thought of Betty Chen, who would undoubtedly insist on helping despite her own busy schedule. The idea of depending on someone else's kindness made her uncomfortable, but she was beginning to understand that independence sometimes required accepting help from others. Walking home from the clinic, Evelyn felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Finally, someone had taken her pain seriously and offered a solution. But the revelation that something foreign had been living in her hand for an unknown period of time was unsettling. What secrets might her own body be keeping from her? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as she approached her home, the familiar sight of Robert's rose garden drawing her attention. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a testament to her faithful care over the past 5 years. She had maintained them as a tribute to his memory, never realizing that her dedication might have been complicated by whatever now required surgical removal from her hand. As she settled into her favorite chair with a cup of tea, carefully gripped in her left hand, Evelyn found herself staring at her swollen right hand with new eyes. Somewhere beneath that inflamed skin lay a mystery that connected to her past in ways she couldn't yet understand. The thought that her body had been keeping secrets filled her with both dread and curiosity about what the coming week might reveal. The surgery was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, giving Evelyn 4 days to worry about what Dr. Harrison might find beneath her skin. She spent those days in a state of restless anticipation, unable to focus on her usual routines of reading, gardening, or organizing her teaching memorabilia. Betty Chen had insisted on driving her to the clinic and staying throughout the procedure. Brushing aside Evelyn's protests with characteristic firmness, "Nonsense," she had said. "What are neighbours for, if not to help during times like these?" On the morning of the surgery, Patricia Williams prepared the minor surgical suite with practiced efficiency. The room had been transformed from its usual examination setup into a sterile environment complete with surgical lights and instruments arranged on a draped tray. Despite the clinical atmosphere, Patricia had placed a small vase of fresh daisies on the counter, a touch that spoke to her understanding of how intimidating medical procedures could feel. Dr. Harrison entered wearing surgical scrubs, his manner both professional and reassuring. "Good morning, Evelyn. Are you ready to solve this mystery?" She nodded, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. The local anesthetic injection stung briefly before her hand began to feel heavy and numb. Patricia positioned herself beside the examination table, ready to offer support both medical and emotional. "You'll feel some pressure but no pain," Dr. Harrison explained, as he made a small incision over the area where the foreign object appeared to be located. "Patricia, could you adjust the light slightly?" As the bright examination light illuminated the surgical site, Evelyn found herself staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the small perforations in an attempt to distract herself from what was happening to her hand. The antiseptic smell filled her nostrils, bringing back memories of Robert's final days in the hospital, sterile rooms, beeping machines, and the constant underlying fear that nothing would ever be the same again. "There it is," Dr. Harrison murmured, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "This is quite remarkable." Patricia leaned closer to get a better view. "How long do you think it's been there?" "Based on the amount of scar tissue that's formed around it, I'd estimate years, possibly decades." Dr. Harrison worked carefully, using small instruments to separate the object from the surrounding tissue that had grown around it. "The body has essentially created a protective capsule around this foreign material." As he continued working, something unexpected happened to Evelyn. The combination of the clinical setting, the bright lights, and the discussion of old wounds triggered a sudden, vivid memory that she hadn't accessed in years. She was standing in her kitchen, angry tears streaming down her face, while Robert shouted from the living room about missed opportunities and broken promises. The memory was so sharp and unexpected that she gasped audibly. "Are you all right, dear?" Patricia asked, noticing Evelyn's sudden change in breathing. "I'm fine," Evelyn managed, though she wasn't fine at all. The memory fragment continued to unfold in her mind. Robert's voice raised in frustration, her own voice matching his volume as they argued about something that had seemed monumentally important at the time, but now felt distant and unclear. Dr. Harrison continued his careful work, occasionally asking Patricia to adjust instruments or provide better lighting. "Almost there. This is more deeply embedded than I initially thought." The memory grew clearer as Dr. Harrison worked. She could see Robert pacing in their living room, his hands running through his dark hair the way they always did when he was upset. They had been arguing about his job, about a promotion that would require them to move away from Millbrook. She had refused to even consider leaving, citing her commitment to her students and her fear of starting over somewhere new. "I have it," Dr. Harrison announced, carefully extracting the object with a pair of surgical tweezers. "This is quite interesting." Evelyn turned her head to see what had caused her weeks of pain. In the bright surgical light, held securely in the tweezers, was a small triangular piece of glass. It was perhaps 1/2 inch long, with sharp edges, that had been smoothed by years of being encased in her body's protective tissue. "Glass," Patricia observed, her professional curiosity evident. "From what kind of source, do you think?" Dr. Harrison examined the shard carefully. "It appears to be window glass, or perhaps from a drinking glass. The thickness and clarity suggest household glass rather than automotive or industrial. The site, of the glass fragment unlocked more of the memory that had begun during the procedure. Evelyn remembered storming toward the kitchen door that night, Robert's words echoing behind her about how she never wanted to take risks, how she was content to live a small life in a small town while opportunities passed them by. She had reached for the door handle with such force, such anger, that the glass panel had shattered on impact. The sound had been sharp and final, like the breaking of something that could never be repaired. She remembered looking down at her bleeding hand, feeling the sting of multiple cuts, but being too angry and too proud to call out for Roberts. "Help! Evelyn!" Patricia's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "You've gone quite pale. How are you feeling?" "I remember," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. "I remember how it happened." Dr. Harrison looked up from his work, concern evident in his expression. "What do you remember?" The words came slowly, as if she were translating from a foreign language. "We had an argument, Robert and I. I was angry, and I slammed the kitchen door so hard that the glass broke. I must have cut my hand, but I was too stubborn to admit it." "When was this?" Dr. Harrison asked gently, beginning to clean and stitch the small incision he had made. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to place the memory in time. "It must have been 30 years ago, maybe more. We were still young then, or at least younger. Robert had gotten a job offer that would have taken us to Chicago." Patricia squeezed Evelyn's uninjured hand supportively. "And you didn't want to leave Millbrook?" "I was terrified," Evelyn admitted, the truth spilling out as if the removal of the glass had also removed some barrier that had kept these memories locked away. "Terrified of leaving everything I knew, of starting over, of failing somewhere. Knew. So I refused to even discuss it." Dr. Harrison finished his suturing and began applying a sterile dressing to the wound. "It's remarkable that such a significant piece of glass remained embedded for so long without causing more problems. The human body's ability to adapt and protect itself never ceases to amaze me." But Evelyn was still lost in the memory, seeing that night with a clarity that 30 years had not dimmed. She remembered Robert coming into the kitchen after the glass had shattered, seeing her bleeding hand, and reaching for her with concern and love, despite their argument. She remembered pulling away from him, wrapping her hand in a dish towel, and refusing his help while glass crunched under their feet. "I wouldn't let him help me," she said softly. "He wanted to take me to the hospital, but I said it was just a scratch. I cleaned it myself and bandaged it, and we never talked about that night again." The room fell silent, except for the quiet sounds of Dr. Harrison cleaning up his instruments. Patricia maintained her gentle hold on Evelyn's hand, recognizing that something profound was happening beyond the simple removal of a foreign object. "Did Robert take the job?" Patricia asked quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "No, he turned it down. We stayed in Millbrook, and he never mentioned Chicago again. But something changed between us that night. We became more careful with each other, more polite, less willing to risk the kind of argument that could shatter glass." Dr. Harrison placed the glass shard in a small medical specimen container. "Would you like to keep this?" he asked. "Some patients find it meaningful to see what their bodies have been carrying." Evelyn stared at the container, at the small piece of glass that had been part of her for 3 decades. It represented so much more than a simple injury. It was a physical reminder of pride, stubbornness, and the moment when she and Robert had begun to build walls instead of bridges between them. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think I need to keep it." As Patricia helped her sit up and explained the post-surgical care instructions, Evelyn felt as if she were emerging from more than just a medical procedure. The glass was gone, but the memories it had unlocked remained vivid and troubling. She was beginning to understand that healing her hand might be the easy part compared to healing the wounds that the glass had represented all these years. The drive home from the clinic passed in contemplative silence. Betty Chen occasionally glanced at Evelyn in the passenger seat, noting how her neighbor clutched the small specimen container containing the glass shard. The local anesthetic was beginning to wear off, and a dull ache was replacing the numbness in Evelyn's hand, but the physical discomfort seemed insignificant compared to the emotional turbulence that the recovered memory had unleashed. "Do you want to talk about it?" Betty asked gently as she pulled into Evelyn's driveway. Evelyn shook her head, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely. The fragment of memory from the surgery had opened a door she had kept firmly closed for 30 years, and she wasn't ready to examine what lay beyond that threshold. Betty helped her into the house, making sure she had everything she needed for the next few hours. Pain medication, water, and easy-to-prepare food that wouldn't require much use of her injured hand. Before leaving, she squeezed Evelyn's shoulder supportively. "I'm right next door if you need anything," she said. "And I mean anything, Evelyn. Don't try to be stoic about this." Alone in her house, Evelyn settled into Robert's old recliner, a chair she rarely used because it still smelled faintly of his aftershave and reminded her too acutely of evenings spent reading together in comfortable silence. Today, she needed that connection to him, even if it came with pain. She placed the specimen container on the side table, the small piece of glass catching the afternoon light streaming through the living room windows. Such a tiny thing to have. Caused so much trouble, both physical and now emotional. Dr. Harrison had explained that the inflammatory response had been triggered by some change in her body, perhaps the natural aging process or a minor injury that had disturbed the delicate balance her body had maintained around the foreign object for decades. But Evelyn suspected there was more to it than simple biology. The timing seemed too coincidental, coming just as she had been feeling particularly isolated and melancholy about the 5th anniversary of Robert's death approaching. Perhaps her body had decided it was time to release what she had been carrying. For too long, the memory from the clinic continued to replay in her mind with unwelcome clarity. She could see Robert's face that night, the way his expression had shifted from anger to concern when he saw her bleeding hand. He had been genuinely frightened for her, reaching out instinctively despite their harsh words. And she had rejected his help, wrapping her hand in a kitchen towel and insisting she could take care of herself. That night had been about more than a job opportunity in Chicago. It had been about their inability to have children, about the growing distance between them as they grieved separately for the family they would never have. Robert's desire to move somewhere new had been his way of suggesting they start fresh, leave behind the constant reminders of their disappointments. Her refusal had been rooted in fear. Fear of change, fear of failure, and fear that leaving Millbrook would somehow make their losses final. The next morning brought little relief from her restless thoughts. Her hand throbbed with a different kind of pain now, the clean ache of healing rather than the deep, inflammatory burn of infection. But the memories continued to surface, each one more vivid than the last. She remembered the weeks following that argument, how she and Robert had moved around each other with careful politeness, like dancers performing steps they had memorized but no longer felt. They had never discussed the job offer again, never addressed the real issues that had led to their fight, never acknowledged the glass-strewn kitchen floor that Robert had quietly cleaned up while she nursed her wounded hand in the bathroom. The 3rd day after surgery, Evelyn found herself drawn to places and objects that might trigger more memories. She opened the cedar chest where she kept their wedding album and early photographs, studying pictures of herself and Robert in their 20s and 30s. They had been happy then, genuinely happy, before infertility treatments failed and career. Disappointments accumulated and small resentments began to build walls between them. In one photograph, taken at a church picnic perhaps 25 years ago, Robert's arm was around her waist, and both of them were laughing at something outside the camera's view. Evelyn stared at this image, trying to remember what had made them so joyful, but the memory remained elusive. Somewhere between that captured moment of happiness and Robert's funeral, they had lost the ability to truly see each other. The antique door handle on their old kitchen door caught her attention as she made her afternoon Tea. Robert had replaced the door itself after the glass incident, but he had kept the original brass handle, a detail she had never consciously noticed until now. She traced the worn metal with her good hand, remembering how angry she had been that night, how the cold brass had felt against her palm just before the glass shattered. That evening, Patricia Williams called to check on her recovery. "How are you managing with the pain?" the nurse asked, her professional concern evident even over the phone. "The hand is healing well," Evelyn replied honestly, "but I keep having memories about the night I was injured. Things I haven't thought about in years." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes, when we remove something that's been in the body for a long time, it can trigger emotional responses. The mind and body are more connected than we often realize." "I keep thinking about my husband," Evelyn admitted, "about how different things might have been if I had made different choices that night. Regret is a heavy burden," Patricia said gently. "But healing, real healing, sometimes requires us to examine old wounds, not just treat the symptoms." After the phone call, Evelyn sat in her kitchen as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. The room where she and Robert had shared thousands of meals now felt charged with the memory of their argument. She could almost hear the echoes of raised voices, almost see the glitter of broken glass scattered across the linoleum. The glass shard in its container seemed to pulse with significance, a tangible link to a past she had thought was safely buried. But burial, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as healing. The glass had remained in her hand for 30 years, causing no apparent harm until suddenly it became unbearable. Perhaps some emotional wounds worked the same way, dormant, until something triggered an inflammatory response that demanded attention. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn made a decision that surprised her. She placed the specimen container on her bedside table where she could see it first thing in the morning. She wasn't ready to fully examine what the glass represented, but she was no longer willing to pretend it didn't exist. The healing progressed faster than Dr. Harrison had predicted. Within a week, the surgical site showed no signs of infection, and Evelyn had regained most of the use of her hand. She could hold her teacup again, button her blouses, and tend to her daily routines without assistance. But the emotional healing proved far more complicated. On a whim that she couldn't fully explain, Evelyn decided to visit Millbrook Elementary School. The building would be empty during summer break, but she knew the custodian, Jim Martinez, would let her walk through her old classroom. She had retired 5 years ago, but the pull to return to that familiar space felt urgent, as if something there might help her understand the woman she had been during those years of teaching while her marriage slowly unraveled. The school hallways echoed with her footsteps, the familiar smell of floor wax and chalk dust triggering a flood of memories. Classroom 3B had been hers for the final 15 years of her career, and walking through its door felt like stepping back in time. The current teacher had decorated the walls with different themes, but the basic layout remained unchanged. Rows of small desks, a reading corner with colorful cushions, and the large windows that overlooked the playground where children had played during countless recesses. Evelyn ran her fingers along the whiteboard where she had written thousands of lessons, guided struggling readers through difficult passages, and praised young artists for their creative efforts. This room had been her sanctuary during some of the most difficult years of her marriage, a place where she felt competent and needed when home felt increasingly cold and distant. The teaching award plaque still hung in its place of honor near the door, though it now belonged to the room rather than to her specifically. Outstanding educator Evelyn Matthews dedicated service to the children of Millbrook. She remembered the day she had received it. How proud Robert had been as he sat in the audience during the ceremony. He had taken pictures with an old film camera, making sure to capture her moment of recognition. But she also remembered how that very dedication had sometimes come at the expense of their relationship. During parent conferences, school events, and countless evenings spent grading papers or preparing lessons, she had poured her maternal instincts into other people's children, while her own marriage grew hollow with unspoken disappointments. The realization hit her with unexpected force. She had used teaching as an escape from the growing problems at home. When conversations with Robert became strained and difficult, when the silence between them felt too heavy to bear, she could always lose herself in lesson plans and student needs. The children in her classroom had given her the sense of purpose and nurturing that she and Robert had been unable to create together. A knock on the classroom door interrupted her thoughts. Jim Martinez stood in the doorway, his kind face showing concern. "Mrs. Matthews, I saw your car in the parking lot. Is everything all right?" Evelyn smiled, grateful for his discretion in not asking too many questions about why she was wandering through an empty school during summer vacation. "I'm fine, Jim. Just feeling nostalgic, I suppose." As she drove home, Evelyn's mind continued to process what she had discovered in that classroom. The teaching award represented genuine achievement, but it also symbolized a choice she had made repeatedly throughout her marriage, to invest her emotional energy in her professional life rather than addressing the problems in her personal life. That evening, she called Betty Chen and invited her over for tea. Betty arrived with homemade cookies and the kind of straightforward compassion that Evelyn had come to depend upon. "You've been different since the surgery," Betty observed as they sat in Evelyn's living room. "Quieter, more thoughtful. How are you really doing?" Evelyn showed her the glass shard in its container, explaining how the removal had triggered memories she thought were long buried. "I keep thinking about my marriage, about choices I made that I never questioned at the time." Betty listened without judgment as Evelyn described the argument with Robert, her refusal to consider moving to Chicago, and her growing understanding of how she had used her teaching career to avoid dealing with their relationship problems. "Marriage is complicated," Betty said finally. "Harold and I went through our own difficult periods. There were times when we barely spoke to each other, when we wondered if we had made a mistake. But we learned that avoiding problems doesn't make them disappear. It just lets them grow stronger in the darkness." "How did you get through it?" Evelyn asked. "We had to decide that our marriage was worth fighting for. Not fighting each other, but fighting for each other. It meant having conversations that scared us, admitting things we didn't want to admit, and choosing to love each other even when we didn't particularly like each other." Betty's words resonated deeply. Evelyn realized that she and Robert had stopped fighting for their marriage that night when the glass shattered. Instead of addressing their real problems, their grief over childlessness, their different approaches to handling disappointment, their growing emotional distance, they had chosen the safer path of polite coexistence. After Betty left, Evelyn found herself drawn to Robert's study, a room she had barely entered since his death. His desk remained exactly as he had left it, with stacks of papers from his work at the county planning office and books about local history that had been his retirement passion. In the bottom drawer of his desk, she discovered something she had forgotten existed, a folder labeled Chicago in Robert's careful handwriting. Inside were job descriptions, salary information, and housing listings from the period when he had been considering the position that had led to their terrible argument. But what caught her attention was a handwritten letter, apparently never sent, addressed to the hiring manager in Chicago. In it, Robert politely declined the position, explaining that his wife's commitments to the local school system made relocation impossible. The letter was dated 2 weeks after their argument, and the tone was resigned rather than angry. Reading his words, Evelyn realized that Robert had never blamed her for his decision to stay in Millbrook. He had accepted her choice and found ways to make peace with it, even though it meant giving up an opportunity that clearly excited him. The letter revealed a man who had chosen his wife's happiness over his own ambitions, even after their relationship had been damaged by that choosing. For the first time since the surgery, Evelyn allowed herself to cry, not just for Robert's death, but for the years of misunderstanding that had kept them from truly seeing each other's sacrifices and love. 2 weeks had passed since the surgery, and Evelyn's hand had healed remarkably well. The small scar where Dr. Harrison had made the incision was already fading to a thin pink line, barely noticeable unless she looked for it specifically. But the emotional excavation that had begun with the glass removal showed no signs of concluding. If anything, the memories were becoming more frequent and more detailed, as if removing that physical barrier had also dismantled some internal resistance to examining her past. She had begun keeping a journal, something she hadn't done since her teaching days, when she occasionally wrote reflective notes about her students' progress. Now she found herself documenting the memories as they surfaced, trying to piece together a more complete picture of her marriage beyond the carefully edited version she had maintained for the past 5 years. The entries revealed patterns she hadn't recognized while living through them. Robert's increasing quietness during their later years, which she had interpreted as contentment or perhaps indifference, now seemed more likely to have been resignation. His tendency to handle household repairs and maintenance without asking for her input, which had annoyed her at the time, appeared in hindsight to be his way of contributing to their partnership when other forms of collaboration had become difficult. On a humid Thursday morning, Patricia Williams called to schedule a follow-up appointment. "Dr. Harrison wants to check how the incision is healing," she explained, "but he's also curious about whether you've remembered anything else about the original injury." The appointment was set for the following Monday, giving Evelyn several days to consider what she might tell them. The truth was that memories continued to surface almost daily, but they weren't all connected to the night of the broken door. The glass removal seemed to have triggered a broader excavation of suppressed experiences, moments she had filed away as too painful or complicated to examine. That weekend, while organizing some of Robert's belongings that she had finally felt ready to sort through, Evelyn discovered a small wooden box in the back of his closet. Inside were ticket stubs, restaurant receipts, and photographs from various occasions throughout their marriage, a private collection of memories that Robert had apparently maintained without her knowledge. The items told a story of deliberate attention to their relationship that contradicted her assumption that he had become indifferent over the years. There were receipts from her favorite restaurant on birthdays she had forgotten they had celebrated, tickets from movies they had seen together during periods when she remembered them barely speaking to each other, and photographs of her taken when she wasn't aware he was looking, moments when her face showed genuine happiness or concentration or peace. One photograph in particular stopped her breath. It showed her working in the garden, probably taken about 10 years ago, her face focused and serene as she pruned roses. She looked beautiful in the image, though she had no memory of feeling beautiful during that period of their marriage. Robert had captured something she hadn't seen in herself, a woman worthy of being photographed with love and admiration. Beneath the photographs was a small notebook filled with Robert's handwriting. The entries were brief, more like observations than diary entries, but they revealed a man who had been paying careful attention to his wife's moods, preferences, and needs, even when their communication had become strained. E seemed happier today. "After working in the garden, should suggest we visit the nursery this weekend." Made her laugh at dinner with story about Mr. Peterson's chickens. "Haven't seen her smile like that in weeks. She's been grading papers until late every night, left her favorite tea and a note on the kitchen counter." The notebook contained dozens of similar entries, spanning several years and demonstrating a level of thoughtful observation that Evelyn had never suspected. While she had been interpreting Robert's quiet presence as disengagement, he had actually been studying her with the kind of devoted attention usually reserved for scientific research or artistic subjects. The discovery left her feeling simultaneously loved and foolish, How had she missed this evidence of his continued care? How had she become so focused on what was absent from their relationship that she had failed to notice what was actually present? Betty Chen found her that afternoon sitting on her back porch, the wooden box and its contents spread across a small table, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, honey," Betty said, settling into the chair beside her. "What have you found?" Evelyn showed her the photographs and notebook, explaining how they contradicted everything she had believed about Robert's feelings during the difficult years of their marriage. "I thought he had stopped seeing me," she said, "but he was seeing me more clearly than I was seeing myself." Betty studied the photograph of Evelyn in the garden, noting the tenderness with which it had been taken. Some men show love through actions rather than words. It doesn't make the love less real, just harder to recognize sometimes. But why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he show me these pictures, or let me know he was paying such close attention? Maybe he was afraid, Betty suggested gently. Maybe he thought you had already decided he wasn't enough, and he didn't want to seem desperate or needy. The possibility that Robert had been as confused and hurt as she was during their difficult years had never occurred to Evelyn. She had assumed that his quietness indicated satisfaction with their distant arrangement, that he preferred the safety of emotional distance to the risk of renewed intimacy. But the evidence before her suggested a different interpretation. A man who had been trying to love his wife in the only way he felt safe to express it, through quiet observation and small, unacknowledged gestures. That evening, she sat in Robert's study, reading through his notebook more carefully, trying to match his observations with her own memories of those days. Gradually, a different version of their later years began to emerge, one in which they had both been trying to bridge the distance between them, but had been using different languages of love that the other couldn't quite translate. The glass shard sat in its container on the desk beside her, no longer seeming like evidence of a moment of destructive anger, but rather like a marker of when they had stopped trying to understand each other's attempts at connection. The night she had slammed that door and embedded glass in her palm, they had both retreated into safer but lonelier versions of themselves. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn realized that healing would require more than just removing what had been buried. It would require learning to see what had been present all along. The follow-up appointment with Dr. Harrison confirmed what Evelyn already knew. Her hand had healed completely. The surgical site showed no signs of complications, and her range of motion had returned to normal. But when he asked about additional memories related to the original injury, she found herself sharing more than she had intended. The glass removal seems to have triggered a kind of emotional archaeology, she explained, sitting in the same examination room where the procedure had taken place. "I keep discovering things about my marriage that I had either forgotten or never understood at the time." Dr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Physical trauma often carries emotional components that we don't fully process until much later. Sometimes the body holds on to things until we're ready to examine them." Patricia, who was present to document Evelyn's recovery progress, leaned forward with interest. "What kind of things are you remembering?" Evelyn described finding Robert's collection of photographs in his notebook, explaining how these discoveries had challenged her assumptions about the emotional distance in their marriage. "I thought he had stopped caring," she said, "but now I think maybe we had just stopped knowing how to show that we cared." After the appointment, Patricia walked with Evelyn to the parking lot, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "I see a lot of people carrying pain they don't know how to release. Sometimes it takes something like this, something physical, to give them permission to examine what they've been avoiding." Driving home, Evelyn found herself taking a detour past the county planning office where Robert had worked for 35 years. The building was modest and practical, housed in a converted Victorian mansion that had been adapted for governmental use. She had visited him there occasionally over the years, usually to drop off forgotten lunches or important documents. But She had never paid much attention to his work environment. On impulse, she parked and walked inside. The receptionist, a woman named Carol, whom Evelyn vaguely remembered from various town events, looked up with surprise. "Mrs. Matthews. How nice. To see you. How are you doing?" "I'm well, thank you. I was wondering if it might be possible to see Robert's old office." "I know it's an unusual request." Carol's expression softened with understanding. "Of course, I don't think anyone would mind. His office was converted into storage after he retired, but most of his personal things were boxed up. Let me show you." The office was smaller than Evelyn had remembered, with a window that looked out over the town's main square. Robert's desk had been replaced with filing cabinets, but the view remained the same, a perspective that had allowed him to watch the daily life of Millbrook for more than 3 decades. "He used to stand at that window every day around lunchtime," Carol said, "especially after he retired but was still consulting part-time. He would watch people going about their business and sometimes comment on how the town was changing." Carol left her alone to look around, and Evelyn stood where Robert had stood, seeing Millbrook from his perspective. The view included the elementary school where she had taught, the clinic where she had recently undergone surgery, and the small park where they had walked together during their early married years. She realized that from this window, Robert could have watched her comings and goings for decades, seen her walking to school each morning, observed her occasional visits to the clinic, noticed when she changed her routines or seemed troubled. This office had been another vantage point from which he had quietly observed and cared for her without her awareness. The thought was both comforting and heartbreaking. How many times had he looked out this window and thought about her day, wondered if she was happy, wished he knew how to bridge the growing distance between them. When she returned home, Evelyn found Betty Chen waiting on her porch with a casserole dish and a concerned expression. "I was worried about you," Betty said. "You seemed so upset yesterday after finding Robert's things." They sat together in Evelyn's kitchen, and she described her visit to Robert's office, her growing understanding of how present he had been in her life, even when she felt most alone in their marriage. "The difficult thing," Evelyn said, stirring cream into her tea with deliberate care, "is realizing that we were both trying to love each other, but we had forgotten how to let the other person know it. We became like 2 people speaking different languages in the same house." Betty nodded knowingly. "Harold and I went through something similar after our youngest left for college. Suddenly we were alone together for the first time in 25 years, and we didn't know how to talk to each other anymore. It took work to remember how to be married to each other instead of just being parents in the same house. But you figured it out," Evelyn observed. "Eventually. It required admitting that we had both made assumptions about what the other person was thinking and feeling, and it meant taking some risks, saying things out loud that we had been keeping to ourselves." That evening, Evelyn sat in Robert's study, reading through his notebook again, but this time she tried to remember what she had been doing and feeling on the days he had written about. Gradually, she began to recognize moments when she, too, had been trying to show love and care in ways he might not have understood. The tea she had made him each morning before work, even during periods when they barely spoke. The way she had always prepared his favorite meals on difficult days, even when she was angry with him about something else. The times she had sat with him while he watched television shows she didn't enjoy, just to be in the same room. She had been trying to love him too in her own quiet way, but neither of them had recognized the other's efforts, and the silence between them had grown until it felt safer than the risk of direct communication. The glass shard in its container seemed to represent more than just a moment of anger now. It symbolized the beginning of their retreat into parallel lives, the point at which they had decided that protecting themselves from further hurt was more important than fighting for their connection. As she prepared for bed, Evelyn realized that understanding the past was only the first step. The question that remained was whether this knowledge could somehow provide healing for wounds that had been left unattended for far too long. 3 weeks after the surgery, while Evelyn was sorting through Robert's desk to create more organized files from his scattered papers, she discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about their marriage. Hidden behind a row of books about local history was a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Robert's careful script. The envelope was thick, as if it contained multiple pages, and the paper had yellowed slightly with age. Her hands trembled as she opened it, immediately recognizing the date at the top of the first page, just 3 days before Robert's heart attack 5 years ago. He had written her a letter and hidden it, perhaps intending to give it to her at the right moment, a moment that had never come. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began, and already she could hear his voice in the formal but tender way he had always addressed her in writing. "I am writing this because there are things I need you to know, things I should have said years ago but never found the courage to express. My doctor tells me that my heart condition is more serious than we initially thought, and the possibility that I might leave you before I can say these words properly has made me realize I cannot wait any longer for the perfect moment." Evelyn's breath caught. Robert had known his health was failing and had never told her how serious it was. She continued reading, her eyes already blurring with tears. "First, I need you to know that I have never regretted staying in Millbrook instead of taking the job in Chicago. I know you have always felt guilty about asking me to turn down that opportunity, but you never asked me to do anything. I chose you, Evelyn. I chose our life together over a job that would have taken me away from everything that truly mattered to me." The words hit her like a physical blow. All these years, she had carried the weight of believing she had forced him to sacrifice his dreams, when he had made that choice freely out of love for her. "I know you think I became distant from you in our later years, and I suppose in some ways that's true. But it wasn't because I loved you less. It was because I loved you so much that I was terrified of losing what little connection we still had. After we stopped being able to talk about the big things, I was afraid that pushing for more intimacy might drive you further away." Evelyn had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by the revelation that Robert's emotional retreat had been motivated by fear of losing her rather than indifference toward their relationship. "I want you to know that I was aware of the glass in your hand that night we argued about Chicago. I saw you wrap it in the dish towel, saw the blood seeping through the cloth, but when you insisted you were fine and refused my help, I respected that choice. I have regretted that respect every day since, because I think it was the moment we stopped being honest with each other about our pain." The confession that he had known about her injury all along was staggering. For 30 years, she had carried not just the glass, but the secret of that night, believing she was protecting them both from examining what had happened. But Robert had known, and his silence hadn't been ignorance. It had been another form of love, respecting her need to handle things in her own way, even when it cost them both dearly. "I kept quiet about so many things, Evelyn, because I thought that's what you needed from me. When you threw yourself into teaching with such intensity, I told myself you were finding fulfillment that I couldn't provide. When you stopped initiating conversations about our feelings or our future, I convinced myself you preferred the peace of not having to discuss difficult topics. I was trying to love you by giving you space, but I think now that I was just giving you loneliness." The letter continued for several more pages, detailing Robert's perspective on their marriage with a clarity and emotional honesty that took her breath away. He wrote about their struggles with infertility, acknowledging how differently they had processed that grief. She by pouring her maternal instincts into teaching, he by throwing himself into work projects that gave him a sense of competence when he felt like a failure as a potential father. He wrote about watching her from his office window, about the joy it gave him to catch glimpses of her going about her daily life, about how proud he was of the teacher she had become and the difference she made in children's lives. He described keeping the collection of photographs and memories not because he was living in the past, but because documenting their good moments helped him remember that their marriage still contained beauty even during the difficult periods. I need you to know that every quiet evening we spent reading in the same room was precious to me. Every cup of tea you made me, every small consideration you showed when you thought I wasn't paying attention, I noticed all of it, and I treasured all of it. We may not have been good at talking about love in our later years, but we never stopped living it in small ways. The most devastating paragraph came near the end of the letter. If something happens to my heart before I find the courage to give you this letter, please know that you have been the greatest joy of my life. Our marriage may not have been perfect, but it has been real and deep and worth every moment of struggle. The woman I married 47 years ago is still the woman I love today, even if we forgot how to tell each other that simple truth. Robert had signed the letter with the same formal affection he had always shown, with all my love and devotion, Robert. But there was a postscript that made her cry out loud with grief and recognition. P.S. I started a small garden behind the shed where I've been growing the varieties of roses you admired in other people's yards, but never asked me to plant. I was planning to show it to you on our next anniversary. If you're reading this letter after I'm gone, please know that every flower I planted there was planted with thoughts of you. Evelyn sat in Robert's study, clutching the letter to her chest as sobs racked her body. The secret garden she had never known about, the window observations she had never suspected, the careful documentation of their love that she had never seen. All of it painted a picture of a man who had been loving her actively and intentionally, right up until his death, even though they had both forgotten how to make that love visible to each other. The plot twist wasn't just that Robert had loved her more than she realized. It was that he had understood their problems with the same clarity she was only now achieving, and he had been trying to solve them in his own quiet way. The glass. In her hand, the emotional distance, the parallel lives they had built. He had seen it all and had been working to bridge those gaps through actions rather than words. She understood now that her body's rejection of the glass shard hadn't been coincidental timing. It had happened as the 5th anniversary of his death approached, because some part of her was finally ready to release the guilt and regret she had been carrying. The glass had been embedded not just in her palm, but in her understanding of their marriage, and removing it had been the first step towards seeing their love story clearly for the first time in decades. The discovery of Robert's letter left Evelyn in a state of emotional upheaval that made the previous weeks of recovered memories seem gentle by comparison. She spent the remainder of that day reading and rereading his words, each paragraph revealing layers of understanding about their marriage that she had never suspected. The man who had written this letter was not the distant, resigned husband she had imagined during their final years together, but someone who had been paying exquisite attention to their relationship and working quietly to preserve what they had built. The reference to the secret garden behind the shed consumed her thoughts. In the 5 years since Robert's death, she had focused her gardening efforts on maintaining his beloved rose beds in the front yard, never venturing behind the storage shed where he had kept his tools and lawn equipment. The area had always seemed like his private domain, and after his funeral she had avoided it entirely, finding the space too filled with his presence to bear. But now, knowing that he had created something there specifically for her, the garden behind the shed felt like a message waiting to be received. Betty Chen found her the next morning sitting on her back porch, still clutching Robert's letter, her eyes red from a night of tears and sleepless reflection. "Oh, honey," Betty said, settling beside her without waiting for an invitation. "What's happened?" Evelyn handed her the letter, watching Betty's expression change as she read Robert's words. When she finished, Betty folded the pages carefully and returned them with gentle reverence. "He loved you so much," Betty said simply, and he understood what was happening between you better than either of you realized at the time. I've been angry at him for 5 years, Evelyn admitted. Angry that he left me, angry that we never figured out how to really talk to each other, angry that we wasted so much time being polite instead of being honest. But he was trying to love me the whole time, and I was too proud or too scared to see it. What will you do now? Betty asked. Evelyn looked toward the shed, knowing that her next step was waiting behind it. I need to see his garden. I need to understand what he was trying to tell me. That afternoon, with Betty providing moral support, Evelyn walked around the storage shed for the first time in 5 years. What she found took her breath away. Robert had created a small but elaborate garden in the space between the shed and the back fence, hidden from view unless someone deliberately sought it out. The area was perhaps 20 feet square, but he had maximized every inch with carefully planned plantings that showed evidence of years of thoughtful development. The roses were varieties she had never seen in their front yard: delicate pink, climbers, deep purple hybrid teas, and cream-colored floribundas with edges touched by apricot. But these weren't the only flowers he had planted. There were peonies in shades of coral and white, the kind she had always admired in the town's public gardens, but never mentioned wanting for their own yard. Lavender plants lined the back border, their purple spikes still fragrant even though they had gone untended for 5 years. In the center of the garden stood a small wooden bench that Robert had built himself, positioned to provide the perfect view of all the plantings. A brass plaque was mounted on the bench's backrest, engraved with words that made Evelyn sink onto the seat in wonder. For Evelyn, who taught me that love grows most beautiful when tended with patience. Betty joined her on the bench, both women, sitting in stunned silence as they absorbed the magnitude of what Robert had created. The garden was clearly the work of several years, not a recent project. Some of the roses showed the established growth patterns that only came with time and careful nurturing. "How did I never notice this?" Evelyn whispered. "Because you weren't supposed to," Betty replied. "He was planning to surprise you. He wanted it to be perfect before he showed it to you." A small garden journal sat in a weatherproof container beside the bench. Evelyn opened it to find detailed notes about each plant, when he had installed it, what care it required, how it was progressing. The entries were written in the same careful handwriting as the love letter, documenting his hopes for each flower, and his vision for how the garden would look when it matured. Planted the coral peonies today. He admired Mrs. Patterson's last spring and mentioned how they reminded her of sunrise. Hope these will bloom in time for our anniversary. The climbing. Rose is finally establishing itself on the trellis. Chose this variety because the catalogue said it was particularly fragrant in the evening. It has always loved sitting outside after dinner. Added more lavender along the back border. Remember how she stopped to smell it every time we walked past. The community garden downtown. Page after page revealed Robert's attention to her preferences, his memory of casual comments she had made about flowers they had seen elsewhere, his careful planning to create a space that would bring her joy. He had been preparing this gift for years, watching her reactions to other gardens, taking mental notes of what made her face light up, and quietly working to recreate those moments of beauty in their own backyard. The garden journal's final entry was dated just 1 week before his heart attack. "Everything is ready now. The roses should be at their peak bloom by our anniversary next month." Finally worked up the courage to show her the letter and bring her back here. "Hope she understands that every flower represents a day I was grateful to be married to her." Evelyn realized that she was experiencing the anniversary surprise Robert had been planning, just 5 years later than he had intended. The garden had continued to grow and bloom in his absence, a living love letter that had been waiting patiently for her to discover it. Dr. Harrison's words from weeks ago echoed in her mind. Sometimes the body holds on to things until we're ready to examine them. Perhaps the glass shard had finally demanded removal, Not just because her body had changed, but because she was finally ready to understand what it represented. The moment when she and Robert had stopped believing they could trust each other with their full truth. That evening, Patricia Williams called to check on her recovery, and Evelyn found herself describing the discovery of both the letter and the garden. "It sounds like your husband found ways to keep loving you, even when direct communication became difficult," Patricia observed. "Some people express love through grand gestures, but others show it through consistent, quiet actions over time. I keep thinking about all the years I spent feeling alone in our marriage," Evelyn said, "when really I was surrounded by evidence of his love. I just didn't know how to see it." "Healing isn't just about removing what hurts us," Patricia replied. "Sometimes it's about learning to recognize what was helping us all along." After the phone call, Evelyn sat in Robert's study with his letter spread on the desk before her, the glass shard in its container beside the pages. The two objects seemed to represent the dual nature of their marriage, the moments when they had wounded each other through misunderstanding, and the constant, underlying current of love that had persisted even when they couldn't find words for it. She had spent 5 years grieving the loss of Robert while also carrying anger and regret about their relationship. But his letter and garden revealed that there was more to grieve, not just his death, but the love story they had been living without fully recognizing it. They had been loving each other imperfectly but genuinely right up until the end, and that truth was both heartbreaking and healing. As she prepared for what she now knew would be a sleepless night, Evelyn realized that understanding the past was leading her toward a decision about the future. Robert's letter had given her the gift of seeing their marriage clearly, but what she did with that knowledge would determine whether his final message would bring her peace or simply add another layer to her grief. The glass shard caught the lamplight, no longer seeming like evidence of failure, but rather like a marker of human complexity, the way love and hurt could coexist, the way healing sometimes required excavating old wounds, and the way truth could be buried for years before. The right moment arrived for its discovery. The decision came to Evelyn in the quiet hours before dawn, as she sat in Robert's secret garden, watching the first light touch the roses he had planted for her. She had spent the night alternating between his study and the bench behind the shed, reading his letter again and again, while surrounded by the living proof of his devotion. The weight of carrying 5 years of misunderstanding had become unbearable now that she knew the truth. She needed to go to him. Millbrook Cemetery occupied a gentle hillside on the eastern edge of town, its well-maintained grounds dotted with oak trees that provided shade for the weathered headstones, marking generations of the community's families. Robert was buried in the newer section, where a simple granite marker bore his name, dates, and the inscription she had chosen in her grief: "Beloved husband and teacher." The word seemed inadequate now, a placeholder for feelings she hadn't known how to express at the time. Evelyn had avoided visiting his grave since the funeral 5 years ago. The finality of that carved stone had felt too overwhelming, too much like accepting that their story was truly finished. But now, carrying Robert's letter in one hand and the glass shard in its container in the other, she knew that avoidance had only prolonged her pain. Betty Chen had offered to accompany her, but Evelyn knew this conversation needed to happen between just her and Robert. She had asked Betty to drive her to the cemetery and wait in the car, providing support without intruding on what felt like the most private moment of her 72 years. The walk from the parking area to Robert's grave took her past familiar names, former colleagues, neighbors, students, grandparents, the interconnected community of lives that had shaped her understanding of love and loss. Each headstone represented someone's story of connection and eventual separation, but today they felt less like symbols of ending and more like evidence of relationships that had mattered enough to be remembered. Robert's grave was marked by more than just the headstone. Someone, probably Betty or one of her other thoughtful neighbors, had been placing fresh flowers there regularly. Today, a small bouquet of roses from his front garden lay against the granite, their petals still fresh with morning dew. Evelyn lowered herself carefully onto the small bench that the cemetery had placed near several of the graves for visitors who needed to rest. Her surgically repaired hand ached slightly from carrying Robert's belongings, but the pain felt appropriate somehow, a physical reminder of the healing she was still undergoing. "Hello, Robert," she said softly, her voice sounding strange in the quiet morning air. "I found your letter." The words opened a floodgate of emotion that she had been holding back since discovering his hidden message. Tears came freely as she spoke to the headstone, as if he could hear her, as if 5 years of silence could be bridged by finally saying the things that had been too difficult to express while he was alive. "I found your garden too," she continued, pulling his letter from her purse and smoothing the pages against her lap. "The peonies are beautiful, just like you knew they would be. The climbing roses have covered the entire trellis, and the lavender still smells like summer evenings. You would be so proud of how everything has grown." She read portions of his letter aloud, her voice breaking on the passages where he had expressed his fears about their emotional distance and his hopes for their future. Speaking his words in this sacred space felt like completing a conversation. They had started 47 years ago and never finished. "I need you to know that I loved you too," she said, addressing the headstone directly. "I was just as scared as you were, just as confused about how to bridge the distance between us. When you became quiet, I thought it meant you had given up on us, but you were trying to love me in the only way that felt safe. I was doing the same thing, making your tea every morning, cooking your favorite meals, sitting with you even when we couldn't find words. But neither of us could see what the other was doing." The glass shard in its container caught the morning sunlight, and Evelyn held it up between herself and Robert's headstone. "This little piece of glass has been in my hand for 30 years, ever since that night we argued about Chicago. I carried it all this time without even knowing it was there, just like I carried the guilt about that argument and the regret about all the things we never said to each other." She placed the container gently on top of his headstone. The glass, visible through the clear plastic like a tiny prism, separating light into all its component colors. "Dr. Harrison removed it from my hand, but you removed it from my heart. Your letter showed me that we were both trying to love each other the whole time, even when it didn't feel that way." The morning air was still and peaceful, broken only by the distant sound of birds in the oak trees and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn felt Robert's presence not as a supernatural visitation, but as the accumulated weight of 47 years of shared life, of small kindnesses, and quiet devotions that had been more significant than either of them had understood at the time. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the cemetery grounds, Evelyn found the courage to voice the words that had been trapped in her heart for 5 years. "I need to ask for your forgiveness, Robert," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears that continued to flow. "Not just for that night when I slammed the door and refused your help with my bleeding hand, but for all the years when I was too proud to let you see how much I needed you, too afraid to tell you how much I loved you." She pulled his wedding ring from her purse, the simple gold band she had slipped from his finger at the funeral home and had been carrying with her ever since, unable to decide what to do with it. The ring had lived in her jewelry box for 5 years, too precious to put away but too painful to look at regularly. "I kept this because I couldn't bear to let go of you," she said, turning the ring over in her palm. "But I think I was also keeping it because some part of me knew our story wasn't finished. Your letter completed something that was left unfinished between us, and now I understand what I need to do." She stood from the bench and approached his headstone directly, kneeling beside it despite the discomfort to her aging knees. The grass was soft and well-maintained, evidence of the cemetery's care for this final resting place of the community's loved ones. "Robert Matthews," she said formally, as if she were addressing him on their wedding day. You were the love of my life, even when we forgot how to show it to each other. You were my partner in all the ways that mattered, even when we got confused about how to be partners in our daily life. You saw me more clearly than I saw myself, and you loved me more generously than I ever deserved. She placed his wedding ring gently on the headstone next to the glass shard, the two objects representing the beginning and the complication of their love story. I'm giving this back to you, not because I want to forget our marriage, but because I finally understand it. We were never really broken, Robert. We were just human beings who got scared and forgot how to trust each other with our whole hearts. The act of releasing his ring felt simultaneously like the most difficult and the most liberating thing she had ever done. For 5 years, she had held on to it as a connection to him, but now she realized that their connection existed in places that didn't require physical tokens. In the roses he had planted, in the memories they had created, in the love that had persisted even through their most difficult years. I want you to know that I'm going to take care of your garden, she continued. Not just maintain it, but let it grow and change the way gardens are supposed to. I'm going to add some of the flowers I love too, make it into something that belongs to both of us. And I'm going to put a new bench there, one big enough for 2 people, in case I ever want to bring a friend, to see what love looks like when it's planted with patience. The reference to his inscription on the original bench brought fresh tears, but they were tears of recognition rather than grief. She was finally seeing their marriage as he had seen it, not perfect, but real and deep and worthy of celebration. Most importantly, she said, reaching out to touch the carved letters of his name on the headstone, I'm going to stop carrying the weight of our mistakes and start carrying the lightness of our love. You showed me in your letter that we were loving each other all along, even when we couldn't feel it or see it clearly. That love doesn't die just because you did, Robert. It keeps growing, like your roses, even when no one is tending it directly. A gentle breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the oak leaves and carrying the scent of flowers from other graves. Evelyn felt surrounded by the presence of enduring love. Not just her love for Robert, but the accumulated devotion of all the couples who had found their way to this peaceful hillside after lives spent learning how to love imperfectly but genuinely. I forgive you for leaving me before we could have the conversations your letter shows we were both ready for, she said. And I hope you can forgive me for taking so long to understand what you were trying to tell me through all those years of quiet kindness. She stood slowly, her knees protesting but her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The glass shard and wedding ring on the headstone caught the sunlight like small beacons, no longer symbols of pain and loss, but evidence of a love story that had been more beautiful than either of its participants had fully realized while living. Goodbye, my dear husband, she said softly. Thank you for loving me so well and for finding a way to help me love myself better. I'll see you in the garden. As she walked back toward the parking area where Betty waited, Evelyn felt the profound peace that comes from finally completing something that had been left unfinished. The conversation she had needed to have with Robert was over, but the life she would build on the foundation of their love was just beginning. 6 months later, Evelyn's hand bore only the faintest trace of surgical intervention, a thin white line across her palm that she sometimes traced absently while reading or thinking. The scar had become a reminder not of injury, but of the courage required for healing. Her grip was strong again, steady enough for all the activities that filled her days with purpose and connection. The secret garden behind the shed had been transformed into something that honored both Robert's vision and Evelyn's own growing understanding of what it meant to tend love carefully. She had kept all of his original plantings, but added her own touches. A small herb garden with basil and rosemary, a patch of sunflowers that followed the light throughout the day, and a new rose variety that bloomed in deep red, the color of the dress she had worn on their first date 50 years ago. The bench Robert had built remained in its original position, But Evelyn had commissioned a local craftsman to create a companion piece, a matching bench positioned to encourage conversation between two people who might want to sit together and share the peace of the space. Between the two benches, she had planted a small flowering tree that would provide shade as it matured, creating a natural canopy for reflection and conversation. Betty Chen had become a regular visitor to the garden, often joining Evelyn for evening tea among the roses. Their friendship had deepened through the months of Evelyn's emotional healing, built on the foundation of Betty's patient support during the most difficult period of her grief and recovery. "You seem different," Betty observed one evening as they sat together watching the climbing roses catch the last light of day. "More settled in yourself, if that makes sense." Evelyn nodded, understanding exactly what her friend meant. "I feel like I finally know who I was in my marriage and who I can be now that it's over. For so long, I was carrying questions that had answers I just couldn't see." The volunteer work at the clinic had evolved into something more significant than either Evelyn or Patricia Williams had initially imagined. What had begun as occasional assistance with paperwork had grown into a support program for older adults. Navigating health challenges and family transitions, Evelyn's experience with delayed healing and recovered memories had given her unique insight into the complex relationship between physical and emotional wellness. "I never expected to find a new purpose at my age," she told Dr. Harrison during one of her regular visits to discuss the support program's progress. But helping people understand that healing isn't always a straight line from injury to recovery, that sometimes we need to excavate old wounds to truly heal, feels like important work. Dr. Harrison smiled, remembering the anxious woman who had come to him months ago with a mysterious swollen hand. "You've become something of an expert on the archaeology of healing. I've had several patients tell me that talking with you helped them understand their own recovery process better." The program had grown to include group sessions where people could share their experiences with complex healing, physical injuries that carried emotional weight, family dynamics that affected health outcomes, and the ways that addressing mental and spiritual wellness could accelerate physical recovery. Evelyn facilitated these gatherings with the same gentle authority she had once brought to her classroom, creating safe spaces for people to examine their own buried truths. Patricia Williams had watched this transformation with professional admiration and personal affection. "You've taken your own healing and turned it into a gift for others," she told Evelyn. "That's not something everyone knows how to do." The most profound change in Evelyn's life was the way she carried Robert's memory. His letter remained in a place of honor on her bedside table, no longer a source of grief, but a reminder of the love that continued to inform her daily choices. She read it occasionally, not to reconnect with pain, but to remember the truth about their relationship when everyday concerns threatened to cloud her perspective. The glass shard from her palm had found a permanent home in the garden, embedded in a small decorative stone that marked the center of the herb garden. Visitors often asked about it, and Evelyn had learned to tell the story of her delayed healing as a parable about the importance of addressing what we carry in our bodies and hearts. On the anniversary of Robert's death, Evelyn had established a new tradition. Instead of marking the day with grief and regret, she opened their garden to the community for an afternoon of shared stories about enduring love. Neighbors brought photographs, letters, and memories of their own relationships, creating a celebration of the ways love persists even after loss. "Robert would have loved this," Betty said during the most recent gathering, watching Evelyn move among her guests with grace and warmth, ensuring that everyone felt welcomed and heard. "He is loving this," Evelyn replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form. His love became this garden, this understanding, this ability I never knew I had to help other people heal." As the evening settled over Millbrook and the last visitors made their way home, Evelyn sat alone in Robert's garden with a cup of tea balanced carefully in her once injured hand. The roses released their evening fragrance into the warm air, and the small tree between the benches rustled with the promise of growth yet to come. She thought about the woman who had walked into the clinic 6 months ago, carrying decades of pain without even knowing it, unable to hold a simple teacup because her body had finally insisted on releasing what she had been afraid to examine. That woman had been healed not just by surgical intervention, but by the courage to excavate buried truths and the willingness to see love where she had previously seen only loss. Some wounds never truly heal, she had learned, but they can be transformed into wisdom, and wisdom can be transformed into service, and service can be transformed into a different kind of love, one that reaches beyond the boundaries of individual relationships to touch an entire community with the gentle power of understanding. In the growing darkness, Evelyn raised her teacup, in a quiet toast to healing, to love that persists, and to the beautiful complexity of human hearts that continue to bloom even after they have been broken.